So as our introduction to vector imagery, the standard vector creating program is Adobe Illustrator. It's a very old program, and they've done a lot over the years to work with it. It's very different than Photoshop, but it tries to look a lot like Photoshop. So when you open up Illustrator, we're just going to play around with it a little bit. So go to File, New. And right from the very beginning, it's a little different. There's no inches here, right? Instead, we are making a document, but what we're actually showing is what the artboard is, because there's no pixels in Illustrator. It's all vectors. So let's give it a name, give it your name, and call it a vector test. The profile we want is based on how we want it to output. So we're going to do it for print, right? But it doesn't matter. A vector is very flexible. The logo you make as a vector file can be used on the web. It can be shown in devices. It can be placed into videos. But print will give us the basic color options and things we need. The artboard is simply something to help us anchor it into reality. So the standard artboard is a letter size, a single artboard. The only reason you might do more than one artboard is if you wanted to quickly render up like 10 different logos with slight variations and have them all print out on separate pieces of paper. So the artboard corresponds to the pieces of paper you're going to print. So we can keep all of these settings at their default. Notice not inches, they use points, the same thing that fonts use for sizing, and that's because fonts are vectors. Every font, every letter form is a certain vector shape, which allows you to have different font sizes that scale up seamlessly. So we say OK. The artboard comes up. Look at the layout. We want to use these default layouts. So the workspace is what's called Essentials. This is very handy. You'll see the artboards right here. It looks like layers. That's because artboards and layers are within the same family. So the artboards are these two empty rectangles, and then the layers are the two opaque rectangles. Layers here are kind of misleading. We're used to layers in Photoshop. Layers here are primarily organizational and to help you kind of lock certain things. But every time you draw a vector, it will automatically create its own separate path that can be selected individually. So none of that makes sense to you yet? I understand. So let's tie it to that shape composition project we did. And let's see how Illustrator would kind of handle what we've already done in Photoshop. So if I go to my basic, or let's see, where was it? My shape exercise that I did in Photoshop. If you remember, when I built this image up in Photoshop, I was using the vector shape tools and just layering them up, right? And because they were the vector tools in Photoshop, they were perfectly clean at any resolution. And how you know something is a vector layer is because in the layer window you have this little box with these little empty squares at the corners. So this individual vector asset allows me to transform it and scale it, and it will always be as perfectly smooth as it can. Illustrator is made up entirely of vector elements like that. So let's create some. Let's just make something really simple. We're going to use the shape tools within Illustrator. They're a little more towards the top because this is what Illustrator does. It's the rectangle. And they'll look very familiar, right? You have the polygon tool, you have the ellipse tool, you have the rounded rectangle tool, you have the rectangle tool. Let's do the ellipse tool. And let's just draw a simple face. Okay? So we click and drag, we make a shape. Now, just like in Photoshop, once we make a vector shape, it's all about the properties we want it to have. So the default properties you see here, it's filled in with white, even though you can't tell that it's filled in with white. That's what this is. That's called a fill. We can change that either up here under our fill options. So let's fill it with something that looks like a skin tone. And we can mix our own colors too using colors. But for now, let's just stick with the standards. Okay? And then you have what's called the stroke. The stroke is an outline. And you see the stroke here, it's indicated in the foreground background. This isn't foreground background though, this is fill and stroke. And it's an empty rectangle with a frame. So the stroke is a black line. Let's change the color of the stroke to a darker version of the skin tone. And so you can see that change there. Now the stroke's pretty thin. If I click off, whoops. Sometimes Illustrator does weird things. Every click has to be pretty precise. Okay, if I click on the Move tool, what we're used to as a Move tool, this is in Illustrator called the Selection tool. And you have the Selection tool and the Direct Selection tool, but I like to think of the black arrow as the Big Selection tool. So it selects the overall thing, and it allows you to kind of move it around and to transform it, just like we can in Photoshop, either by scaling it or by rotating it. So just get a handle on those tools. Okay, but if I click off of it, it will show it to me without that vector box. And you'll see that that outline stroke is pretty thin. So other properties you have for stroke is its thickness and some other fun things. So let's click on it again, and let's change the stroke size to something a lot bigger, like 18 point. Really bold. Okay, let's click it again, and let's change it. It's 18 point, but it's uniform right now. So that same stroke, that same outline is always the same all the way around. Let's change it to not being uniform. Let's make it go thin to thin. So where it picks a point that starts and stops from that point, it gets all the way up to 18 point and goes back down to 1. Or my favorite, let's do various, where it's trying to simulate kind of pin pressure. Even though you can't tell it where to start and stop the thickness, it will make it look kind of more hand done. And then depending on newer versions you have of Illustrator, you'll have various where it never gets quite so thin, which is pretty nice. And you can have some weird ones too. And these are just on the style of the line. That one I don't know when you would almost ever use, but anyway. Okay, I'm going to take it back to my wobbly one that I like. And then of course, as long as I have it selected with that large selection tool, I can change the point size and I can mess with it. Okay, the next option is, do you want to use a basic line, or do you want to draw that line with a shaped tool? So if I say I want to draw it with a flat 5-point brush, that's going to change how it looks too. Now it's a little bit sharper and thinner. Or with an oval, that helps even out the wobbliness a little bit. So if I really wanted to make it look like it's like inked by hand, I might use this with the 5-point oval brush. What if I don't want to make it look like it's inked? What if I want to make it look like it's done with charcoal or another type of outline? Well, then I might use this charcoal feathering brush, which doesn't look as good as it sounds, but it does break up the line and yet keeps it all as a vector. So now here's the fun part. Once you have that charcoal one, I want you to click off of it, and then I just want you to use Command plus to zoom in. And don't stop. Just keep zooming until you can't zoom anymore. And you'll see that no matter how close you get to it, you will never see the pixels. Right? So every little cut goes all the way down to just this infinite point, because these are cutouts. They're not grids of pixels. On the stroke, on the path, I can see a tiny little tail there, because this is just kind of a randomly outputted messing up of the line that this brush definition tool does. But it doesn't change. Its resolution is perfect no matter what. That is the great strength of vectors. Okay, so strokes are amazing, but they're really hard to work with. For me, you can do some of these other ones, like these fancy different stroke lines, and again, they'll always be perfectly clean. They're great for certificates and borders. They have very strange options sometimes, like denim. I don't know who thought of that, but now this one is made of pixels, and this just maps a JPEG pixel image to the stroke. And you notice the difference. I zoom in on that, I see the pixels. But if I choose one that's not based on a JPEG, like this soft-edged stroke, each of those is a perfectly clean, infinitely scalable piece. So I like that. I haven't used that one before. The soft fan brush. Now, the problem with it, let's try to draw a face now using that brush. Okay, so I'm going to choose the pencil tool. I'm going to set my settings. So let's do like maybe 8-point variable width, this brush, that color. And I'm just going to start drawing. So let's draw an eye. And then I'm going to apply these settings to that line. So what I need to do is use the dropper tool. And while that's selected, I have to click on this to match it. And it can't match all those stroke properties for this example. So there's a lot of kind of irksomeness with Illustrator. Because if I try to match it, this is why using strokes is very difficult. It will give me something that I couldn't have ever anticipated would come from this line. So everything has to be kind of uniquely handled in terms of its attributes, its properties. What do I want? So I want something like that. And then once I find what I want, then maybe I can try to be a little bit more creative with it. So then I say, okay, I know that with those properties is going to be about that big, right? But here's the beauty of it. It doesn't render them ever into pixels, so I can redraw that line as much as I want. So this is using strokes. And we can just draw our shapes with it, and we can decide to just make them look kind of clean. So I kind of like this background, but maybe I want my eyes, using the small selection tool, I can pick the individual strokes. Maybe I want them to be more typical, right? So I'll choose my settings, draw some lips. But just everything has to be very precise in Illustrator. Here, this is a good lesson. Okay, so let's say I want to draw a lower lip. So because I'm using the pencil tool, if I leave it open like that, where it doesn't contain the shape, it has no fill. And if I force it to have a fill, like this, it's going to make it up. So it will go wherever I started and stopped, and it will put a straight line between those 2 points and fill that with the color. But I can also choose to have empty space with that red line. That just means no fill. And if I ever want to match something I've already done, I can use the dropper once it's selected and just click on that, and it will match that format. And then I can modify it some more. But for some reason it won't modify, it won't pick up, the dropper won't pick up everything. Maybe it will in a later version.